Right, I want to go over how to do the problems for the Chapter 1-1 business organization. So the first problem, Averill invested $60,000 in a partnership with Lane, Jules, Ray, Ravi, and Petra. The total investment of all partners was $320,000. What percent of the business does Averill own? So to find the percent of something, you have to take the part, which in this case is 60,000, and divide it by the total. And in this case, it's 320,000. So if you do the part divided by the total, you divide these numbers, you're going to get the decimal 0.1875. And then to change from a decimal to percent, you times by 100. So the percent will be 18.75%. Okay, and that's what the percent of the business that Averill owns. She owns 18.75%. Now, be careful when you do this. You have to read these problems carefully. If it asks you to round them, sometimes it'll ask you round them to the 10th or to the 100th. If it doesn't, just leave as many decimal points, as many positions after the decimal as you have. So don't just round it off to 19% or 18%, okay? All right, so 2, the Metropolitan Corporation has insured a total of 2.4 million shares. The Northside Investment Group owns 7.5% of those shares. How many shares does Northside own? So this is a perfect example of where a proportion could be used, okay? Proportion has 2 fractions equal to each other. The second one always has 100 at the bottom, always. Okay, now it says that the investment group owns 7.5% of the shares. So if you know the percent, it always goes over 100. The first fraction is the part over the total. So we know what the total is. The total is 2.4 million. We don't know the part. That's what we're trying to find. So if you do cross products, you would do 2.4 million. Okay, and then you would divide that number by 100. So this times this equals 100. Well, let me just do it this way. 100 times x. And then you divide both sides by 100, and you get x equals 180,000 shares. Okay, Enid, Eve, and Tammy have formed a partnership. The total investment was $400,000. Enid owns 35.4% and Eve owns 28.8%. How much did Tammy invest? Okay, so we know that 2 of the people own these percents. So if you add these together, you're going to get 64.2. So 100% would be everything. So if we take 100%, we minus the 64.2, we're going to get Tammy's percent. So Tammy owns 35.8% of the business. Now, they want to know how much money she invested in it. So if there was a total of 400,000 and Tammy invested 35.8%, we're going to change that percent to a decimal by moving the decimal 2 places to the left. So we times it by 0.358, and that's going to give us Tammy's percent, which is 143.2. Okay. Allie, let's see. Now the next one is 3 partners are investing a total of $1.2 million in a restaurant. They invested in a ratio of 6 to 8 to 11. And they want to know how much each person invested. So this is one of the ratio problems. So with a ratio problem, you look at each part. So one person has 6 parts, one person has 8 parts, one person has 11 parts. So 6 plus 8 plus 11, if you add them all together, it's going to equal up to 25 parts. So 6x plus 8x plus 11x equals 25x, 25 parts, and this is what each part's worth. So we take 25x and we have it equal to the 1.2 million. And if you divide each side by 25, you're going to find out what each part is worth. And so when we divide by 25, each part's going to be worth $48,000. Now, that's not our answer. That just tells us what each part is worth. So now we have to take the parts, the 6, the 8, and the 11, and times it by the 48,000. So one person has 6 times 48,000. One person has 8 times 48,000. And one person has 11 times 48,000. Okay, so if you multiply this, you get 288,000. If you multiply 8 times 48, you get 384,000. And 11 times 48,000 is 528. And if you added these all together, they have to add up to the original $1.2 million. Okay, so these problems confuse students sometimes, so make sure you understand it's really quite simple. You add the ratios together, and that's the total parts, put an X with it, have it equal to the total dollar amount, solve for X, and then you're going to take each of your parts and times it what each part's worth. Okay, next question. Allie, Beth, Callie, Dave, and Eddie, they invested $4.914 million in a business venture. The ratio is 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, respectively. They want to know how much Allie and George invested. So, first of all, we have to figure out how many parts. So, we're going to add 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7. And if you add those all together, there's 28 parts. Okay, if you add these all together, you get 28. 28 parts, the 28 parts equal $4,914,000. You're going to divide each side by 28, and then it's going to give you what each part is worth. So each part's going to be worth $175,500. Okay, now, Allie and George. Well, all we want to know is what Allie and George own. So Allie is the first person, George is the last. So Allie would have 1 share, George would have 7 shares. So 1 times the 175.5 would be 175.5. That's Allie. George has 7 shares, so 7 or 7 parts. So if you times that together, George will end up having 1.228500. So $1,228,500. That would be George's investment. Okay. All right, I'm gonna get another piece of paper here. Okay, so Dennis, so the next one. Dennis owns 24% of a partnership. Beth owns 48%. If the partnership, if Rich is the third partner, what percent of the partnership does he own? And then write a ratio to represent it. Okay, so here's what we know. Dennis owns 24%. Bob owns 48%. Okay, we need to find out what percent Rich owns. So 24 plus 48 is 72. So the 2 of the parts together equal 72. So 100% is the total. If we minus 72 from it, we get that Rich's part is going to be 28%. Okay? So Dennis owns 24%. Bob owns 48%. Rich owns 28%. If you add these together, you get 100. Now, that's our ratio. Ratios, you can just break it down as percent that each person owns. Now, to reduce it, you want it simplified. So these numbers can all be divided by 4. 24 divided by 4 is 6. 48 divided by 4 is 12. 28 divided by 4 is 7. And that's the ratio, simplified ratio, 6 to 12 to 7. Okay, next one. Angel owns 5/8 of a partnership in a bakery. What percent of the bakery does he own? Well, you can change a fraction to a decimal by just dividing. You get 0.625. Okay, and to go from decimal to percent, you times it by 100. So Angel owns 62.5% of the business. Part B says his partner, Lisa, owns the remaining portion of the bakery. Write a simplified ratio showing her her ownership in the bakery. Okay, so there's a couple ways you can do it. One way is this. Angel owns 5/8 of a business. That means there's 8 parts. Okay? So if Angel owns 5 of the parts, that means Lisa must own the other 3. So 5/8 plus 3/8 equal 8/8, which is a whole. All right? So 8 parts, 5 plus 3 is 8. That's your ratio, 5 to 3. Okay, next question. Austin owns 7/16 of a jewelry store. The total investment for the store was $832,000. What's the value of Austin's share of the business? So first of all, we've got to figure out what percent Austin owns. So if he owns 7 out of 16, so 7 divided by 16 would give us 0.4375, which is the same as 43.75%. That's Austin's percent of the business. Now, we can use this and set up a proportion again. Remember, proportions are 2 fractions. We always put 100 here. If we know the percent, it goes on top. So we know the percent because we figured that out. So 43.75 goes here. Now, what else do we know? We know that the total investment was the $832,000. So the total always goes in the denominator. And we're trying to figure out the part. So a proportion, you cross multiply. So 832,000 times 43.75 equals 100x. And if you do cross products, if you multiply this times this and then divide by 100, you're going to get 800. I'm sorry, you're not going to get 800. You're going to get $364,000. That's the part. So that is Austin's part. And if you take this and times it by 43.75%, you would get that. Okay. Penny owns 5/9 of a business in a movie theater. Her investment's worth $450,000. What is the total investment made for the movie theater? Okay, another proportion. 5 divided by 9. If you do that, you get 0.555 repeating. So that's going to equal about 55.55%. Now, your answers are going to be off a little bit depending how you round this. So I'm going to use 55.55. Now, we set up proportions again. 100 always goes in the bottom. If you know the percent, it goes on top. Like I said, depending how you round this, you might get a slightly different answer. Okay, we know that Penny's investment is worth $450. So that's the part. So the part goes on top. And we're trying to figure out what the total investment is. So we do cross products. So 450 times 100 equals 55.55x. So 450, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 equals 55.55x. Divide both sides by 55.55. And you're going to get x equals, and depending, like I said, depending how you round this, if you use 55.55, you're going to get this number. That's a 0. Okay, so the part over the total, which we don't know, the percent over 100. Cross products, solve for x. The total amount of the investment was $810,081. Okay, 10. Get this all on here. 10 is the Barnaby Corporation insured 2.7 million shares of stock at its beginning to shareholders. How many shares must a shareholder own to have the majority of the shares? This is an important question. So to have the majority of the shares, you have to have more than half of them. So a couple ways you could do this. We could find out what half the shares are. You could times it by 50%, or we could just divide it by 2. And if you get half the shares, would be this. 1,350,000. Excuse me. All right, so this is half the shares. So in order to be a majority shareholder, you have to have more than that. So in order to be a majority shareholder, you'd have to have at least one more share. Okay, majority means, so if I have a company and I want to expand it, I issue stock. The problem with issuing stock is now there are other owners, not just me. So if there's other owners, that means they have a say in the business. In order to make my vote count more, I have to have the majority of the vote. So if this was my corporation, I'd have to have at least 1,350,000 and one share. And then whatever I voted on would overrule everybody else. So that's one of the reasons the majority is important. Okay, 11. Ella owns 15% of Fitz Corporation. The rest of the shares are owned equally by the remaining 5 shareholders. What percent of the corporation does each of the other shareholders own? So there's 100% together. If Ella owns 15%, that means there's 85% left over. And if there's 5 other shareholders that own this 85%, and they own equal shares, if you do 85 divided by 5, each shareholder would own 17% of the company. Okay. Problem 12. Problem 12 is this. Clinton and Barbara are partners in a local music shop. They need $448,000 to start the business. They invested at a ratio of 11 to 12. Okay, so a ratio of 11 to 12 means there's 23 parts. 11 plus 12 is 23. So there's 23 parts. Okay, we want to know what each part's worth. So 23x equals the 448,500. Divide both sides by 23. Oop, if I can write right. And each part is going to be worth $19,500. Okay, now one person has 11 parts, so 11 times 19,500. And the other person has 12 parts, so 12 times 19,500. Okay, if you multiply those out, you get one person invested $214,500. The second person invested $234,000. And if you add these two up, they need to equal the 448.5. What percent of the business does Clinton own? Round to the nearest tenth. Okay, there's 23 parts, right? If Clinton has 11 parts, 11 divided by 23 will give you 0.4782. Now, here's a question. It says round to the nearest tenth. So you need to be careful because if you don't round it right, you actually answered the problem wrong. So 11 divided by 23 is this. If I times this by 100, I get 47.82. Rounding it to the 10th means one place after the decimal. So I look at this number, it's less than 5. So rounding it properly would be 47.8%. Okay, Andrea and Dina and Lindsay invested in a partnership with a ratio of 7 to 9 to 14 respectively, which means that Andrea has the 7 parts, Dina has the 9, and Lindsay has the 14. 10 years later, the partnership was worth $1.8 million, and Dina decided to move to Europe, and she sold her part to Andrea. How much did Andrea pay Dina for her share of the partnership? And you want to round it to the nearest dollar. So we got to figure out what each part's worth. So how many parts are there? So 7 plus 9 plus 14, there's 30 parts. And if you do 30x equals $1,800,000, okay, divide by 30, divide by 30, you get each part equals $60,000. Now, Andrea is going to pay Dina for her share of the partnership. So Dina has 9 parts. Each part's worth $60,000. So 9 times 60 means that she has to pay $540,000 to Dina to buy Dina's shares out. B says, what percent of the business did Andrea own after she bought out Dina? Round to the nearest tenth of a percent. Well, Dina and Andrea together owned 7 plus 9, which is 16. So 7 plus 9 equals 16. Okay, there were 30 parts altogether. So 16 divided by 30 would give you 0.533, repeating. And if you times it by 100, you get 53.33, but they said round it to the nearest tenth, so it'd be 53.3%. Now, what was the new ratio of the ownership once the business was owned only by Andrea and Lindsay? So now there's only 2 people that own it. Andrea owns 16 parts, and Lindsay still owns her same 14 parts. Okay, you add these together, there's 30 parts, but what we want to do is we want to reduce it. So both of these numbers can be divided by 2. So the ratio becomes 8 to 7. Okay, you guys don't have to do problem 14. So problem 15. 55.5% of shareholders in a fast food chain are under the age of 40. If the corporation is owned by 86,000 investors, how many of the shareholders are over 40? Well, 40 and over. Okay, so if 55.5% are under 40, we got to find out how many are over. So there's 100%, and we subtract the 55.5. You get 44.5% are going to be over 40. And then we want to figure out how many people that is. So if there's a total of 86,000 investors, we're going to times it by that 44.5% as a decimal. So as a decimal, you got to move it 2 places to the left. So it's times it by 0.445. And if you do that, you're going to get 38,270 people are over the age of 40. So a question like this you have to read very carefully, because what they want is they already know how many people are under 40. They want to know how many are over 40. Okay, last question, 17. So 17 says a partnership is owned by 25 partners and is worth $5.4 million. The partnership loses a lawsuit worth $6.2 million. How much of the settlement is each partner liable for after the partnership is sold? Explain. Okay, so the partnership is worth 6.2 million. Okay? They lost 6.2 million. All right? The partnership is only worth 5.4 million. So this is what they lost. This is what it's worth. So the difference is, if you subtract these, you get, let me make sure that's right. Yeah, you get $800,000. Okay, so 6,200,000, you have to write it out. Okay, equals $800,000. Now, remember, this is a partnership, so they can come after you personally. So not only did this company lose their total business, which was $5.4 million, they owed an additional $800,000. So if there's 25 partners, you have to take what they still owe, divide it by 25 partners, and each partner is going to have to come up with $32,000 of their personal income or personal net worth to cover the partnership's loss. And that's why it's important to incorporate. If they were incorporated, they wouldn't lose their personal money. So that's how you do the problems in section or for worksheet 1-1.